Hey everybody, Bren here. Welcome back to a new video. Today we're going to be starting a new series. Actually, we're going to be starting 3 new series this week. And the first one, well, it's a D4 opening. We're going to be bringing this D4 opening all the way to 2000. Can you guess what it is? It's probably in the title. But we are going to be playing. Let's just let it build up. Even if it's in the title or anything, let's just play it out, and then we'll deal with it. All right, we're playing the London. This opening has a lot of positive and negative connotations to it. So over the next bunch of weeks, I would like to look at a bunch of different lines and see exactly what's going on under the hood. Why are people not liking this opening? Why are people liking this opening? What the critical lines are, and everything in between. So last time we did a King's Indian attack repertoire, and the way that one went was a bit interesting. I took it more from the approach that it was something new to me. I played similar positions as Black a long time ago, like a year or two ago. And because of that, it was kind of like approaching the opening for the first time almost. Now, I wanted to do something a little different. And that is essentially trying to make sure that it's not first impressions and that I've done some research ahead of time for you guys. So we could have played h3 there. So if we ever see knight h5, we can tuck the bishop back. I'm actually being extremely flexible here because there's a funny idea in these types of positions where you go h4, h5, and if they take with the knight, you sacrifice in exchange. I think it's better with the bishop on d3, but the reason why I didn't want to play that is because sometimes there can be e5 tactics where after takes, there's e4. And that's definitely something to watch out for, because if that happens, then that can be a nightmare. But luckily, we're not dealing with that today. So bishop g4 was played. Interesting. I don't think they want to actually exchange on f3. And that's because it gives me the long diagonal. So I'm going to play h3 and just ask them where they're going. Very normal positional move. And unlike the King's Indian attack, which was our previous run with the white pieces, we are taking more of the center. So we have to worry less about being very, very accurate in some situations. And that's why a lot of people like the London system, is you don't have to be 100% accurate to maintain a good position. So e5 is interesting. And e5 begs the question, do we actually take on e5? Or do we just move away immediately? Like bishop g5. I want to play bishop g5 if anything, because right now we could take on b7. The thing is, I don't know if I want to take on b7 immediately, because after taking on f4, we take on a8, they take on e3. If we recapture, rook takes e3, or king might run into some danger. So bishop g5 is the safer move. And this also has a trick up its sleeve. e4 does not work anymore. Can you figure out why? If you found it, you're a genius. The idea is that now that the bishop is on g5, we're actually pinning the piece to the queen, and we can actually take it with the knight. e4 is only defended after e4 by the rook, not the knight, because the knight is in a pin. So if they play something like h6, we're actually okay with this, because we can just take on f6 and take on b7, and we'll win the exchange. So that's really important. All right, so this doesn't solve their problems with the b7 pawn. Sorry about the interruption there. Okay, so now the c5 does not solve any problems in regards to the threat on b7. So we're just going to take this pawn and take on a8 if we're allowed to next move. And it's very likely that we're going to be allowed to. We're not really worried of them taking on d4 and then taking again or anything, because I think we just take on a8 and we're extremely happy there. Being up a piece is Very important. If it was an exchange, that's a little different, right? Some of the other variations that we saw originally were when we're up in exchange and they take on e3, we have to take back, and then they have like rook takes and moves like that, which could be very uncomfortable. But here, after takes, I believe we'll castle. And yeah, it looks like we have an extremely healthy position right off the bat. And we are winning. We're up 3 points of material, or +3. But I want to make sure that if I ever use the term plus or minus in this series during the game, that it's noticed that it's referring to the material count, never an evaluation. So because we're +3 right now, which means if you look at the material, we are up in exchange, which is +2, but we are also up a pawn because we took on b7, so that's +3. It doesn't mean that the evaluation of a position would be +3. So just in case if there's any confusion there, want to make sure that that is resolved ahead of time. So e4, what is something that we can do here? Well, our knight on d2 isn't really the most inspiring piece. I think if we brought it to c4, it would be a little bit happier. After knight to c4 and d5, what's our next move, though? What is our next move? Because we could go knight e5, which gives back a pawn, but we give back that pawn in a way where we're still up the exchange and we have a great position. I don't mind that. But I also don't mind moves like b4. b4 is a funny idea. And that's trying to force tension or force some sort of resolution, my apologies, on the central squares, essentially. So after the tension is resolved, now all of a sudden, they don't have moves like d4 and like c4 or anything, or d5. And this is a lot less scary because, okay, now we kind of have the battlegrounds chosen for us already. So we can either... I'm looking at taking on f6, but I'm also looking at moves like knight b3. Because I want to do this in a strategic way. I'm going to play the move rook a to c1. And the reason why is because I'm going to talk a lot more about strategy when it comes to this opening specifically, as well as our opening against d4 when we get to that, which will be coming up later this week as well. I think after this, we can push. I don't mind pushing because I think it's kind of annoying to stop. So let's push and play a4 and cement the pawn on b5. So for strategy, when we're talking about how do we look at these sometimes quiet positions and what do we do about them, right? If there's like a symmetrical structure or a slight imbalance, sometimes it can be difficult to come up with ways to get an advantage. But there are ways to do it. And one of the ways is to look at what is your worst piece and how can you improve it. So rook a to c1 is one of those moves, right? It goes from a closed file to an open file. And next, I want to play queen b3. And queen b3 is following that strategic sense. And what's the idea of queen b3? The idea is actually to try to get this rook in the game. So where do the rooks belong here? The rooks belong on the open file. So I want to play moves like rook c2 or rook c5, something along those lines. Rook c5 I'm a little bit less sure of. Maybe it can be kicked with like a knight going to d7 or something. But yeah, something like rook c2, bringing the other rook to c1, and then we can start invading on the 7th rank. So we'll have to see what our opponent does here. Our opponent's been playing quite well, actually. The only mistake they've made so far is letting me take on b7 and a8. But everything else feels very logical. Their pieces feel like they're on good squares. and I don't feel like they've done anything hugely wrong because of that. Rook d8 is actually a reasonable move. I think if they play rook c8, they're kind of playing into our hands, because whenever you are down material, you do not want to trade things off the board. You want to trade pawns, but you don't want to trade pieces. So if they played rook c8 and we got to take, then that serves another strategic goal, which is when you're up material, trade pieces, but not pawns. The reason for this is, let's say hypothetically you're up a knight, right? And it's 8 pawns and a knight versus 8 pawns. Like, that's it on the board. Obviously kings too. So you look at that position and you think, okay, this looks pretty good. And then you start thinking to yourself, okay, all I got to do is use my king and my knight to force the win of other material. Because when you're up that much material, eventually you can just kind of force matters and your opponent can't really do anything about it. For example, even if you gave up your knight for 1 pawn and it's an 8 versus 7, most of the time that's just going to win the game, right? And sometimes you're going to have to trade off a few pawns to, you know, maybe you have to go from an 8 versus 8 to a 6 versus 6 or something, and then just like win 1 pawn, 6 versus 5, and then it's winning. So the reason why that's actually important is because if you look at the same scenario where it's a knight and 8 pawns versus 8 pawns, but all the pawns come off the board for both sides, all of a sudden it's a draw. You can't do anything about it. So that's something to avoid. And that's kind of like a very specific scenario, but it's still a very important one. So I'm seeing a tactic here. It starts with rook to c7. And this is going to be a very funny one. So after the queen moves, I think we have the move knight takes e4 here. But we have to be careful that knight to c4 doesn't cause us any trouble. And we can potentially avoid that with rook to c6. Knight takes e4, knight c4, there's always b6 as well. And I think those exchanges do help us, but those are pawn exchanges, so let's maybe not do that quite yet. If I go rook here, knight a8 might actually win this rook. That might be annoying. So we got to think here. Knight takes e4 is the desirable move. We're after knight c4. I cannot take on f6. Oh, maybe I can actually. Take on f6. King takes f6. Then I can just move my rook. Knight takes e4. Knight c4. Knight takes f6. Queen takes c7. Then there's knight takes d5. And we're winning this knight on c4, which is really important, actually. And how many pawns would we be up? It would be queen versus rook, but we're up like 3 pawns. So it actually just forces a simplification in a very weird way. So knight takes e4, I think, is the best move. And they have to see knight c4. I don't see any alternative here. The point is that this is actually pinned. This pawn is not defending the e4 pawn, because we have queen f7 followed by queen to h7 with checkmate. So knight c4, knight takes f6, and then queen takes c7, knight takes d5, and then we can end up taking on c4 at the end there. And it's actually still 3 points of an advantage for us, but it simplifies into an ending that is just completely winning. So, because we get rid of their central pawns here, and we essentially exchange our exchange back for central pawns, which I think is a strategically desirable thing here. So knight takes e4 is very interesting. I don't think we have to cash out like this, but I think it's a very interesting way to. Yeah, so they didn't see knight c4, which is fair. I'm going to end up taking here on c8. They cannot take with the queen because the rook could take. So Because of this, I can now take on d5 or on f6 first. I actually like taking on f6 first, right? Exchange pieces in these positions. So we're still up the exchange. Now queen takes d5. And we can see that, yeah, this is completely winning. So that's really nice. We're happy about that. So knight b6. Then we go rook c6 check. Okay. This doesn't work from a tactical perspective. So there's a funny looking move here. The problem is we want to play rook takes c8, but we can't. So how do we defend our queen in a way where we can just take on c8 by force? We actually have the move queen to e5 here. After queen to e5, it's with check and it's defended by the pawn. And the problem is if they capture a queen, we just recapture with the pawn and they're in check and the knight drops. It's a double attack. We're attacking their king and the knight on c8 here. And now this pawn will just promote. So my opponent ends up resigning, which I think is a fair thing to do. And let's look at the game. Yeah, so the way I'm going to be playing this, there's going to be a few things that we're going to try. We're going to be trying positions of d4, d5. We're going to be generally throwing in knight f3 first. We could go bishop f4, but I want to maintain flexibility, and there's very important reasons that I will discuss later on. But in these positions after d4, d5, or even d4 knight f6, the reason why I like playing moves like knight f3 first is because we don't know if they're going to be playing e6, d5, or g6. And knight f3 is kind of like a nice waiting move for us, where it's a developing move that doesn't create any concessions and kind of forces our opponent to make a decision now. Like, there's not really many moves that I can think of that don't give away what they're doing. If they play b6, they're going for Queen's Indian setups. If they go c6, it's probably going to be something Slavic, like d5. If they go c5, we might enter Benoni territory, but we're probably not going to be playing Benonis. We're going to be playing c3 against c5. G6, we're going to get like some Grunfeld, King's Indian structures there. E6 might be from Nimzo players. So they're generally going to be going d5 right after that. And yeah, there's a ton of ways to play there. So yeah, just going over the first bunch of moves here. There is a funny idea in these positions to go for an early h4. So after d6 here, knight bd2 is, yeah, I think that's fine. And after castles, we could actually try h4. It's a very tricky line, and the idea is just to go for h5 and completely blow things up. So if black kind of makes a nothing move here, then h5 is actually justified. And the idea here is after knight takes, rook takes, pawn takes, we have ideas like bishop d3, knight h5, and trying to take on h5 here. And this can get pretty crazy and messy with queen e2 and long castles as well. So even if you see something like bishop g4, you don't really need to worry too much. Just queen e2 and you can castle long. These positions can be played in so many different ways. But generally it's involving attacking the weakness on h7, the newly created one. And they're going to bring a knight to f6, but we're going to discuss those types of attacks much later on. For now, we're just focusing on the basic development schemes instead of crazy attacks like that. So if you're not going for that, generally I think the bishop is better on e2 than it is on d3. I see a lot of players bring the bishop to d3 in these positions, but I think that's kind of a mistake, because it allows e5 and e4 tactics. So if we make a normal move here, bishop d3, and they play kind of a funny move, queen e8, already there's some subtle threats that are going on that aren't immediate. They are not immediate because they need to play knight d7. So let's throw in another move, c3, knight d7, and castles. And now we're in trouble because e5 is going to hurt us. And e5, the idea is after takes, Well, they have too many defenders, the bishop moves, and e4. And the idea of queen e8 is so bishop g5 isn't played. So, for example, if you bring this rook over instead, and then like c3, knight d7, and castles, there's not really as many problems, because bishop g5 here could be annoying, where after e4 there's knight takes e4, and you're exploiting this pin. So yeah, this queen e8 move can sometimes pop up, and you want to be a little aware of it. But that's a really good attempt to equalize and even fight for an advantage as black, despite it looking very strange. But again, all these things will be covered in due time throughout the series here. So anything else? I think that's mainly it. That's kind of what I wanted to discuss here. And it's always good to throw in moves like h3. So the good thing about having this bishop on f4 is it's on a good diagonal. Despite it being a bad bishop, right? It's on the same color as its central pawns, which generally means it's kind of like tripping over them. But since it's outside of the pawn chain, it's actually a pretty good bishop. So one thing that you'll often see here is moves like h3. So if knight h5 is ever played, you don't have to worry about playing, weird moves like bishop g5, like bishop g5 and getting into things like this, which is actually working for us. We can try things like this, but even still, that's really, really messy and actually might not specifically work. Let me turn on the evaluation after g5. Knight takes g5 does work. Yes, it does work. Okay, cool. And the idea here is that after knight f6, you go like h4, h5, h6. But again, that's the reason why h3 is a good move to throw in, because now knight h5, you can meet it with bishop h2. And you keep your bishop, and what's this knight doing on the side of the board, right? All right, thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys are excited and ecstatic, I don't know, synonyms, about this series. So we will be doing one of these games a week, and I will also be covering some master games, and I'll be doing some lessons as well. Before, I was doing a pretty much a video almost every single day on these runs. Instead, I'm thinking of doing about 3 a week, so one for each opening, one as white, one against e4, and one against d4, and c4 and others like that. That'll be kind of mixed in with d4 there. And I was hoping to do a lot more lessons. So we'll see how that goes. If that's preferred, we'll stick to it. Then if not, then we'll just go back to more of these games. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.